Hello and welcome to this lecture, and in this lecture we will learn how to create a basic calculator application using Tkinter. So we have already learned about the basics of Tkinter, and using those basics we are actually going to go ahead and build a simple calculator application. So currently I am using Mac, and if you actually open up the calculator, this is what a calculator on Mac actually looks like. So we are going to try to build a similar sort of application using Tkinter, and obviously it won't be as beautiful as this one, but still we will try to build as close as possible. Okay, so let's first go ahead and get started with building the app. So the first thing which you need to do is that you obviously need to import everything from Tkinter. So we will type in from Tkinter import star. That means we want to import all the elements like buttons, labels, and everything like that. Now what we will do is that we will import parser as well. So parser is actually going to help us to solve the mathematical equation which is going to pop up on the calculator. So we will type in import parser, and once we have imported that, the next thing which we will do is that we will create the root window. So we will type in root equals, that's going to be tk. And once we have the window, let's set the title for this window. So that's going to be root.title. And in here, let's pass in the title name as calculator. And once this thing is done, we are basically good to go. Now the final thing we need to do is that we need to put this window in a main loop. So in order to put it into a main loop, we will type in root.mainLoop. And after this we are basically done. So now let me just save the code and try to run this app, and as you could see, this is how our calculator right now looks like. So as you could see, there are currently no elements on the calculator, and now we are actually going to go ahead and learn how we could put elements, that is the buttons and the input field over here on our calculator app. So the very first thing which we will do is that we will go ahead and we will create the input label. So I'm going to go right in between these two lines over here, and I'm going to give a comment over here which says adding the input field. So this is going to be the field wherein if we press a particular number, or when we press a particular button, the number is actually going to appear over here in this input field. So let's name this field as, let's say, display. So we'll type in display equals, and that's going to be entry, because whenever we actually want an input field, we name it entry. So here let's pass in the root, stating that this belongs to the root, and then what we will do is that we will add this to our main window in form of a grid layout. So we will type in display.grid, and in this grid let's specify the row. So we will type in row, and the row is going to be 1, and the column span, that is how many columns this is going to span, and that's actually going to be equal to 6. And the final thing which we want to do is that we want this layout to spread from west to east. So we will type in sticky equals w plus e. So once this thing is done, you could simply save the code and run this application to see how this thing looks like. So as you could see, this is what the application now looks like. So we only have the input field over here, which is having the row as 1, and it's actually spanning 6 columns over here, as you could see, and it actually spreads out from west to east, that is from left to right. Okay, so once this thing is done, we could now go ahead and add buttons to this particular calculator. So I'm again going to give a comment here, and I'm going to type something like adding let's say buttons to the calculator, and in here let's start adding our buttons. So what we will do here is that we will start building these buttons column by column, or let's say row by row. So we will first design the buttons in the first row, and then we will move on and design the buttons in the remaining rows. So let's first type in button, and obviously you want to have this button attached to the root, and let's say the text in the first button is going to be the number 1. So let me just specify text equals 1, and then once this thing is done, you also need to specify what happens when you press this particular button, and for that purpose you actually need to go ahead and add a command over here. But for now we just want to display the button here, and we don't want to make it functional. So we will simply go ahead and type in grid to basically attach this button to a grid, as we have done with this display over here. So dot grid, and we will place it on the second row, and we will actually go ahead and place it on the second row instead of placing it on the first row. So we will type in row equals 2 and the column is going to be equal to 0. So once we have this button over here, let's again save the code and let's run the code to see how the button looks like. So as you could see, the button is aligned to the left, and now what we wish to do is that we wish to go ahead and add other buttons as well. So what I'm going to do here simply is that I'm going to copy the same line of code so as to save time. I'm going to replace this thing with 2, this thing with 3, and over here, instead of changing the rows, I'm actually going to change the columns so that these buttons actually lie in the same row but in different columns. So now if you again save the code, run the app, and if you bring up the calculator over here, as you could see, we have 1, 2, 3 over here in the same row but in different columns. Now similar to this, we are actually going to build out the other columns as well, other rows as well. So we have the third row and the fourth row at the bottom. So what I'm going to simply do here is that I'm simply going to copy this stuff. I'm going to paste it over here, This is going to be 4, 5, and 6. This is going to be 7, 8, and 9. And over here, it's actually going to be row number 3, 3, and 3. And this one is going to be 4, 4, and 4. And obviously, these things are going to remain the same. So once we are done with this, what you could do is that you could simply save the code. You could again run this application, and as you could see, we now have all the numbers over here. Now once we have added up the numbers over here, we also need to add other buttons like the clear button, the 0 button, the equal to button, the buttons for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division as well. So what we will do here is that we will add those buttons as well. So I'm going to type in here a comment. So that's going to be adding other buttons to the calculator, and in here let's go ahead and create another button. So that's going to be button, which is going to be attached to the root, and after that we will specify the text over here. So the text is going to be equal to, let's say, AC, which is all clear, which is going to clear the entire input over here, which is this entry over here. So whenever you want to erase everything from your calculator, this is the button which we usually press. And now let's also arrange it on a grid. So we will type in .grid, and this time we want to arrange it on the row number 5. So we'll type in row equals 5, and the column is going to be equal to 0. And what we will do here is that we'll copy the same line of code for other 2 buttons on this row as well. So I'm going to copy it, paste it over here, and the next one is going to be, let's say, for 0. So we will specify 0 over here, and the next one is going to be for the equal to sign. So let's specify the equal to sign over here. This is going to be column 0, this is going to be column 1, and this one is going to be column 2. Okay, so once this thing is done, let's also go ahead and add the buttons for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So what we will do here is that we will again do the same thing. That is, we will basically copy the entire bunch of code from here, and we will paste it right over here. So this one is actually going to be plus, this one is going to be for minus, this one is going to be for multiplication, and we obviously want one more at the bottom for division. So let me just quickly go ahead and paste that over here, and this one is going to be division. Okay, so once this thing is done, what we will do is that we will also set up proper rows and columns. So now instead of arranging them in the same row, we want this to be in the row 2, row 3, row 4, and row 5, and all these columns should actually be equal to column 3, because as you could notice, we have not placed anything yet in the column number 3. So we'll specify column number 3 for each one of them. Okay, so once that thing is done, you could again go ahead and run the code so as to see how this looks like. Okay, so as you could see, our calculator is actually shaping up and it looks pretty good at the moment. So now the next thing which you need to do is that you obviously need to add a few more buttons over here. So you actually need to add a few more functionalities, let's say like the calculating the pi of a number, the percentage. You also need to have the bracket sign, the exponential. You also need to have a button to delete a single digit from your calculator instead of clearing out the entire screen. You also need some other things like let's say calculating the factorial, calculating the square of a number, or anything like that. So here what we will do is that we will also add another new operations. So I'm going to comment this out saying adding new operations. So what we will do here is that we will simply copy the same code from here, paste it over here, and simply change a few things. So this is going to be pi, this is going to be, let's say, the percentage sign, this one is going to be, let's say, the opening bracket, and this one is going to be exp. And for the rows over here, this is actually going to be the same, that is, it's actually going to be placed in the same rows, but in case of columns, we need to change those columns to 4 instead of 3. So this column is actually going to be placed right next to this particular column. So make sure that you replace every 3 with 4 over here. And then finally, you need one last column over here in your calculator. And this is actually going to include some operations like the delete operation. So that's actually going to have some sign which looks like a backspace. And you also need to have, let's say, the factorial sign. You also need to have the closing bracket sign. And finally, let's say you want to have something like the square of a number. So once this thing is done, we are almost good to go. Only we have to change the columns over here. So let's replace every 3 with 5. And once we are done with this, let's save the code and see how our application looks like. Okay, so this is what our application looks like. And I guess it looks decent, not that attractive at all, but it looks decent. And right now, if you click on any button, as you could see, it obviously does nothing, and we have to make it functional yet. So from the next lecture onwards, what we will do is that we'll go ahead and we'll try to make this calculator application functional so that this thing would actually work. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.